That everybody's here. It's good to be back with you guys after we were out last week with our illness. If you guys have a Bible there, I want to invite you to turn to Genesis chapter 3. So, Genesis chapter 3 is where we're going to be. We're going through a series. It's called The Coming of the Way, and it's an Advent series. Advent simply means coming. And so, through the month of December, we are trying to prepare our minds and our hearts sort of in a fresh way, a reminder of how we should think about the coming of Jesus. Why should it matter? Why should it matter to us? There's actually a real grace from God that there's certain rhythms throughout the year that allow us the opportunity to remember particular elements of the gospel. And so around Easter, we have that opportunity because we're front and center with the cross and the resurrection. And Christmas, we're front and center with what Christian theologians have called the incarnation, or simply that God became man, that the second member of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, took on human flesh and came and dwelt among us. And so this is a really great time of year to be able to reflect upon that. And so that's what we're going through this series with, the coming of the way. In Genesis chapter 3, while you're turning there, I'll just start by saying, any of you guys ever watch any of the Marvel movies? Anybody? Nobody? Yeah, I figure. They're pretty big, right? Tons of people watch the Marvel movies. Any superhero movies at all. Marvel's gotten really big, Marvel and the DC, in the last few years, but they've been big for a long time. My dad was reading the comic books and still loves the comic books and would still talk about the Adam West Batman and a lot of that kind of stuff, right? So in our culture, they've been big. Superheroes have been big for a really long time. And that's a fascinating thing to consider. Do you ever wonder why? Like, why are we attracted to superheroes? Why are we attracted to those narratives? They're kind of silly if you really think about them. Spider-Man got bit by a radioactive spider, started shooting webs out of his arms. Batman is really just a rich guy with a bunch of super cool gadgets. And most of these are universes that it's like, well, these things don't really make sense. Superman was basically an alien, more or less. So why are we so drawn to these things? Maybe today we could say because the movies have a lot of action, which they do. They're just kind of exciting. If you're sort of an adrenaline junkie, the movies might appeal to you simply because of that. Maybe today, at least, again, it's because they have great cinematic production, which is true. They're really cool movies to watch. But I would actually submit that there's a deeper reason why superheroes have such a hold on our culture, and why they even transcend generations in their ability to attract interest. And I would submit that it's because there really is something deep within the human heart that longs for a hero. That there really is something deep within the human heart that desires for somebody good to come and triumph over the evil in the world. Because we are often confronted with the reality of evil in the world and in our lives. And so we are often hoping for somebody to rescue us from our enemies, or even rescue us from ourselves. And so what if I told you that feeling is real? We have a real need for a hero. What if I told you that our world and our lives, they really are broken beyond repair? Or what if I told you that God promised a hero who would come and that his work would put all these movies to shame? So as we look at this text today, we're gonna take a look at the promised way. And so I'm gonna ask my friend Kara Lee to come, and she's gonna read for us Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 to 24. Thank you, Carolee. Excuse me. This is the word of the Lord for us this evening. And so that particular story, if you were here last week, it might have picked up a little bit where Pastor Chato was. If you weren't able to join us that last week and you're here, it might feel like you're getting dropped into the middle of a story right there, and you kind of are. So let me explain a little bit what's happened. In the book of Genesis, this is the very first book of the Bible, if you're unfamiliar. And in the book of Genesis, it's telling basically the creation story, how all of us came to be. One of the popular questions sometimes it's asked is, who are we and how do we get here? And Genesis chapter 1, 2, 3 in particular answers it. This is Christianity's answer. It would actually be Judaism's answer as well. They'll diverge on the person of Jesus. But this is the answer to that. So we saw that God created, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, creates the world and everything in it. And he creates Adam and Eve, the first man, the first woman. Maybe some of these pieces of this story would be familiar to you. But what happened in the first part of Genesis chapter 3 is that God had given them a command. He said, hey, you can't eat from that tree. And then what happens is at the beginning of chapter 3, and maybe this is a bit familiar to you, there's a serpent that comes along. And the serpent, he deceives Adam and Eve. He tells them, basically lies to them about what God said, about what he didn't say. And in that deception, they eat. That's what the Bible defines as sin. Disobedience, moving away from the commands of God, missing the mark of God's commands. And so what Carolee read for us is actually when God comes and he begins to pronounce judgments because of sin. And the main point of this text that we read is this: it's that human reality is fundamentally changed and ultimately broken because of sin. That's what we see in Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 to 24. It's that human reality has been fundamentally changed, right? So that means your reality, my reality. The claim is not, this is a story that happened a long time ago. The claim is, this thing that happened explains your life today. It explains my life today. The human reality is fundamentally changed and ultimately broken because of sin. But in this, there are glimmers of God's grace along the way that provide hope. So that's the main point of this text. Human reality is fundamentally broken because of sin, but even throughout that, there are glimmers of God's grace that provide hope. And that's what will bring us to the main point of this sermon. And that's this: that there is hope in the promised way. Even in the midst of all that sin has taken, there is hope in the promised way. What we're going to do is we're going to walk through the text. We're going to look at the fact that the world and everything in it are now primarily marked by the effects of sin. We're going to see that in 4 points, because God is going to, there's going to be 3 types of interactions that he has in the text with 3 different types of people, and then we'll get to the hope in the fourth. The 4 points are going to be, first, we're going to see God's curses against the serpent. We're going to see his judgments against the woman, which is Eve. We're going to see his judgments against the man, which is Adam. And then we're going to see the hope of the promised way that's kind of tucked in the middle of all that has come because of sin. So if you'll look with me, keep that Bible close to you, because we're going to be in it the whole time. First point, we want to look at the curses against the serpent. We see those in Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 to 15. This is God talking to the serpent. He says, "The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this," what did he do? He deceived Adam and Eve. "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." So when we look at this text, one person who commented on this text refers to curses against like the natural serpent and the spiritual serpent. I like that language because what's important to recognize there, this is a little bit of a tricky passage. What's important to recognize is that what the Bible is going to teach from this point forward is that ultimately the serpent should be understood as who we would call Satan, the devil, the adversary, the ultimate enemy of God and man. Satan is an angel who rebelled against God. He took a significant portion of of angels with him in his rebellion. And in fact, the Bible would present the idea that Satan is behind the scenes influencing all of the evil, all of the sin, all of the pain, and all of the death in the world, just as he influenced the rebellion of Adam and Eve that cast the world into sinful brokenness. Satan is at war with God, as we see in that particular temptation that he gave to Adam and Eve. He's at war with God, and because of the fall into sin, all of humanity is actually aligned with Satan in war with God. And we see that with Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve side with the serpent. If you read the beginning part of Genesis 3, they don't side with God. The serpent comes and they're like, yeah, we're with him. We're going to do what he says. And that's the story the Bible presents of humanity from that point forward. And this is the fundamental reality of our present existence, according to the Scriptures, that there is a war between God and Satan. It plays out right there in the early parts of the Bible. And the fundamental reality of our existence is that you and me, when we're left to ourselves, we don't side with God, we side with Satan. If this whole thing sounds maybe a little mythological or like a sci-fi novel, I want to say that I'm sympathetic to that, and I can understand that. If maybe you're thinking, man, this all seems crazy. You're talking about a talking snake and God and the devil, and you're telling me that this is why the world is the way that it is? Angels and demons and all kinds of strange things. I understand if that sounds maybe a bit strange. What I would submit is that at least part of the reason this sounds strange to us, if it does, is just simply because of the culture that we live in. What I mean by that is we live in a culture in America, particularly in like Western nations, so like Europe, America, for the last couple hundred years, have really been influenced by things like secularism, naturalism. If you don't know what those terms mean, basically it just means that the only thing that's real is that which we can kind of put in a test tube and figure out. And the answers that we have to all the ultimate realities of the world are simply naturalistic. And so because of that, a lot of times we just don't have any room for supernatural things in our thinking, in our minds. When we start wondering why things are the way they are, we can't bring supernatural ideas into it. It has to be purely defined as natural in natural ways. And what I want you to know is that's just cultural thinking. There are other parts of the world today that they wouldn't automatically go to that place. If you went to South America or to the Middle East, they would not have a hard time opening the beginning of Genesis and at least having the idea that there are supernatural realities at play in the world. That's purely an American, purely a European, purely a Western problem because we've been given over to ideologies that just say we just don't believe in that kind of stuff. We don't think that way. And so if you maybe think that way, my encouragement is I really want you to question why you think that way. Because there are a lot of people in the world that don't default to that place now. That's a little bit of a side note. But I want to address if that sounds a little bit strange, but I also want to challenge you a little bit to think about why that sounds strange to you. Because there's a lot of people in the world that the supernatural elements are assumed, actually, in how they view the world. And so it's a little bit of a side note. If we go back in, as I said, the Bible lays out Satan as the instigator of war with God that leads to all misery, suffering, and death in the world. And so God has a curse in that text for the natural serpent and the spiritual serpent. The natural one's going to grovel on his belly. The spiritual one is promised that there's going to be enmity between him and the woman. That's the promise, the curse that God gives is that there's going to be one who comes from the woman who's going to crush his head. And that's good news. And this is the first glimmer of hope that's presented to us. Hope in the promised way. I want you to bookmark that in your mind because we'll come back to that in a little bit. And a second important point from this passage that I just want to point out to us before we transition to the judgments against the woman is that if we were to read the whole passage, there's actually only two things that the Bible says are cursed in the passage, that are actually cursed, which is strong language biblically, to incur a curse from God. There are two things that are cursed. One of them is the serpent, And the other one is the ground. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Why does that matter? I would submit it matters, or we should pay attention to it, because the serpent is cursed because of his deception of Adam and Eve. But he doesn't pronounce a curse upon Adam and Eve. He pronounces judgments. There are consequences for their sin. But he does not speak to them the same way that he speaks to the serpent. He does not curse them. And in fact, throughout it, he's offering them glimmers of mercy and grace. The serpent, there is none. He talks to the serpent and he says, I'm going to bring somebody that's going to crush your head. There's not a lot of mercy or grace in that. You are cursed above all animals, and I'm going to bring somebody that's going to crush your head forever. But to Adam and Eve, there's signs of grace, even the fact that there's one who's going to come to crush the serpent. So the point in that I want us to recognize is that God curses the serpent, but he offers mercy and promises hope to sinful people like you and me. That even in the midst of the disobedience, the heart of God is grace towards them. Even as he metes out punishment for their sin, we can see shades of that grace. And so as we transition, we're going to go to our second point, which is the judgments against the women, or the woman, rather. In the next two sections, judgments against the woman and the man, they're going to show the reality of sin and how all of our lives are affected by it. And the call here for us is going to be to consider how we've sinned against God and others. And to consider how, as well, to consider how our experience in life is marked by frustration and deep pain because of sin in the world. So I want to invite us to go there and to consider that, so that then we might find hope in the promised way. So if we look at verse 16, where God's going to lay out some judgments against the woman, against Eve for her sin. Verse 16, he says, to the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So what we see in the judgments against Eve, and we'll see them against Adam as well, is that the judgments have a direct effect on really God's fundamental command to them. Which if we were to go back to chapter 1, he creates them, and what does he say? Maybe you've heard this before. He says, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. And so these judgments that come that cause the marring because of sin, they're connected to that fundamental call, that fundamental command. In many ways, that fundamental piece of their existence. For men and women, our most fundamental parts of our nature are broken because of sin. For the woman, there's two things in the text that God promises. These things are broken because of sin. And this is the punishment for sin. And it's the woman's experience in pregnancy, childbirth, and it's her experience in marriage that are just broken because of sin. And so what we see is that instead of a woman being able to fulfill her role as a childbearer purely in the beauty and the glory that she should have, now it's often marked with pain and suffering. And we often make jokes about how hard pregnancy is or those kind of things, but the reality is it is no joke. Pregnancy is really hard. Childbirth is really hard. It's not only physically hard, it's often dangerous. For the woman, for the child, for everybody that's involved in it. Things like pregnancy, labor pains, as well as even harder things like infertility or miscarriages or even death are now all part of that reality. And this is the effect of sin. It's not a game. It's real. What should have been a glorious calling for women is now a calling that, though there is glory that is still seen in it, it's often marked with great pain from start to finish. And that's the weight of sin. Not only is that experience affected by sin, but often marriage as well. That's what we see in the text. Eve was created quite literally for Adam. Like if you follow the original creation, she was created to be a beautiful and life-giving helper for him as he carried out God's command for him and his family. And instead, our marriages can often be some of the greatest, if not the greatest source of misery in our lives. Because our marriages can be marked by relational strife, competing desires, miscommunication, passive aggressiveness, or even outright hostility towards one another. They can descend into emotional or even physical abuse, as well as emotional and physical unfaithfulness. And at worst, they can even end in divorce. Instead of being a place of life, our marriages can often be a place that feels like death because of the amount of sin that we throw out and the amount of sin that we receive back. And so we see the weight of sin. This is heavy, and it should be. Eve was created to be a helper to Adam, to help fill the earth with children. But we see in the text both her relationship with him and her ability to do that have now been affected by sin. And maybe the same is true for some of us as well. Everything is marred by sin. God help us. That's true. Let's continue down, look at the judgments against the man that God speaks of because of sin. Looking at verse 17 to 19, and then we'll skip ahead to 22 to 24. Verse 17, and to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. You shall eat the plants of the field by the sweat of your face, and you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and the dust you shall return. Verse 22, then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, in knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the garden he placed a cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. And so in this text we see three judgments that are laid down against the man. We see that the ground is cursed, we mentioned before. We see that physical death is coming for him, and that he has been driven from the presence of God. If we were to look at the first one, look at each of those in their place. The first one is that the ground is cursed in verses 17 to the first part of verse 19. I'm not going to read it again, you can look there. But the central command to the man, if we were to go back again when he was created, was to rule the earth in God's place. God created an amazing world, and then he crowned the man and us with unimaginable glory. As he essentially said, here is my creation, now it's yours, subdue it. Make it your own. And this remains a central command to all humans today, but particularly to men in the nature of the marital relationship. But the reality is that because of sin, now it will nearly be impossible to actually complete. And that's what we see in the text is a promise that the ground is actually going to fight against the man now. It's going to be hard. He's going to till the ground, and it should have produced fruit and vegetables and life, and instead it will often produce thorns and thistles, and it'll be by the sweat of his brow that he makes a living out of it. It'll be hard. It would have been bountiful. It would have been fruitful before sin, and now it's going to be hard. You'll get some stuff out of it, but it's not going to be easy. He will work really hard for all he gets, and sometimes he'll work really hard and not get what he's due. He'll work really hard and he'll get thorns and thistles instead of food that he can eat. And this can apply to men and to women in similar ways. But I want to look particularly to the men that are here and just say, men, this is why the call to lead your family is hard. Like, this is why it's hard. This is why your job is hard through the day, and then you come home and your houses and your cars fall apart. The bills pile up, you work hard, and maybe don't even get paid a fair wage for the work. It's because all of it is cursed because of sin. The ground itself is cursed because of the sin of our first parents and because of our sin. And that's why it's hard. Not only is the ground cursed for the man, the first man, and for us, but in fact his body is actually breaking down. Physical death is coming. as a result as well. We look in the text, that was what we see in the back part of verse 19. He says, "For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." The promise was if they eat the fruit, then they will die. And so we see that starting to come to fruition. And this is a reality that certainly applies to everybody because of sin, to all men and women. We were created to live with God forever, but now our bodies break down because of sin. That happens throughout the course of our lives. It happens as we get older. Sometimes we don't even have to be getting older. We have particular ailments, particular ways that our bodies just don't hold up over time. And for many of us, even the point to the end of our lives can be marked with constant chronic pain all the way there. And that's hard. I've experienced some of that in my own life. And it's really hard, and it's really frustrating, and it's really difficult. And we have to see that the reason we feel that mortality, according to the Bible, is because of sin. Lastly, and this is the most significant judgment because of sin of any of them that we've seen so far. And so if it's 6 o'clock, if you're getting drowsy, I want you to pull in right here, because this is the most significant judgment that we need to recognize because of sin in the entire point. And that's what happens verses 22 to 24, where God actually sends him out of the garden and us in him out of the garden. He is disconnected from God because of his sin. And we are as well. This is a reality that is, again, though it was given to the man, it's true for all men and women. It is the greatest problem of sin. Sin causes a lot of problems. The world is completely marred because of it. All of our experiences marred because of it. Our lives are broken because of it. Our hearts are broken because of it. But the greatest problem with sin is that it separates us from God and incurs his judgment against us because of sin. Because of this, we are exiles. And in many ways, all the pain that we feel in our lives in one way or another can be connected to the fact that we are separated from our life source, who is God, because of sin. Our sin separates us from the fount of all goodness, of all beauty, of all life. And so then our experience of life is void of all of those things often. And we get little glimmers. But it can be void completely. We see in the text that Adam is disconnected from God, banished from the garden. And he has what's called a cherubim in the text, if you see, guarding the way back in. Cherubim might be unfamiliar to you. It's essentially an angel. And all throughout the Old Testament, the cherubim are actually set as constant reminders to the people of God that they are disconnected from God because of their sin. If you were to go through the Old Testament, they decorated the ark with cherubim, they decorated the tabernacle with cherubim, and they decorated the temple with cherubim. All of these places were places where God's Spirit was meant to dwell among the people, and yet while he was with them, it was a constant reminder that the cherubim was still in place, that they were still separated, ultimately, because of sin. So that's the weight of sin in the text and in our lives. And where does this leave us? It's a great question. It's been heavy up to this point. Where does this leave us? Because we've seen the consequences of sin. We've seen the way that our lives are marked by sin, and we feel this. And we often moan beneath these weights. We cry beneath these weights. We feel the weight of infertility or miscarriages. We feel the weight of broken marriages. We feel the weight of hard responsibility and the sting of sickness, death, and separation from God. So where does this leave us? Some of you might be thinking, man, it seems like a great sermon for Christmas. It's wild. What am I doing here? What I want you to know is that this is actually the perfect sermon for Christmas. Because Christmas is about the light of the world shining into our darkness. Because Christmas is about the Prince of Peace coming to reign in the midst of a world of chaos. Christmas is about the sinless one coming to bear the full weight of human sin and rise in victory over it. Christmas is about the hope of the promised one, buried in the middle of all of the pain and the misery of the effects of sin. Buried in the middle, there is a promise that one will come and that he will shine in the midst of the unspeakable darkness that has been unleashed because of our sin. And that brings us to our fourth point, which is the hope of the promised one. Let's read verse 15 again. He says, I will put enmity, that's war, hostility between you, serpent, and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. What we see in this text is what Christian theologians have called, here's a $10 theological word, the proto-evangelium. That's a $15 word, probably. But if you think about what that means, if you hear of like a prototype, it's a thing that comes before, right? Like, Elon Musk's rocket had a prototype that probably couldn't get off the ground. It's a prototype. The proto-evangelium it's the gospel. It's the good news of Jesus Christ preached, in a sense, beforehand. And that's what Christian theologians have recognized, is that in the middle of all of the misery and the judgment that's being unleashed in this text because of sin, buried within it is the first preaching of the good news of Jesus when God himself says to the serpent that there's going to be one that comes from the woman, and he, is going to crush your head. He will bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. There's going to be blows that are exchanged, but they're not going to be equal blows. There's going to be a nick on the foot and a crush to the head. And it is this good news that Jesus is going to come and crush the serpent and liberate us from the effects of sin. That he is going to be born of a virgin, live a life without sin, die on the cross for sin, and raise in victory over sin. That he is going to carry the judgment for sin upon himself. He is going to fulfill the curse against Satan, and he's going to reverse the curse against the creation. Let's look at those three just very briefly. We talk about the judgments carried, the judgments that we've seen in this text. Jesus himself is going to come and carry them. Because Jesus took all of the pains of sin upon himself. He was born of a woman. He died to reconcile his spouse, the church, back to himself. He endured the weight of responsibility in the garden clear to the point where he sweat pools of blood beneath the pressure of the cross. He hung on the cross with a crown of thorns on his head, carrying the curse of creation with him as he descended into death. And then he raised in victory over all of it. He even had a moment on the cross where the scriptures would seem to show that he genuinely experienced a type of separation from God. He cried out to God, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so he carried the judgments of sin so that sinners like you and I could find hope in him. In the midst of the world of pain and misery that sin has unleashed. And so I would call you today, believe in him. Recognize sin, recognize its effects in the world, recognize your own sin against God and others, and believe in Jesus, because in the midst of a world of sin, there is hope in the promised one. We would also see that the curse against Satan, that proto-evangelium, is actually fulfilled. If we were to turn to the book of Colossians in the New Testament, which I'm not going to do right now, you're free to do that though. The book of Colossians is actually going to tell us that Jesus crushed Satan at the cross. That's where the crushing of the head happened. He crushed him. And how did he do that? Well, Colossians tells us Jesus did that by canceling the record of debt that stood against us because of our sin. So sin incurs a debt before God. God is holy and righteous, like we taught the kids today, and he doesn't look past sin. He never can. But in fact, on the cross, he judges his son for the sin of his people, for people like you and me. And Jesus disarmed Satan by dying for sin and then removing his ability to accuse us for sin. Jesus died for sin so that whoever places their faith in him has all of their sin forgiven. And the law of God does not condemn the one who has faith in Jesus because Jesus has fulfilled all the requirements of it in their place. In the place of people like you and me, if we turn to him in faith. And so if your faith is in Jesus, you've turned from sin, I want to encourage you simply that according to the testimony of God's word, your sin is forgiven. The record of debt has been canceled. Satan cannot condemn because Jesus has crushed him. And there is hope in the promised one. Lastly, the curse against creation reversed. As I mentioned, Jesus, isn't it amazing? He took a crown of thorns on his head. That's an amazing thing to consider. Crown of thorns on his head. Crown of the busted up creation. He took it into the grave with him and he raised, as what the scripture says, the firstborn of a new creation. And he, in fact, promises a second advent. When we talk about Advent or the Advent season, which is Christmas, it's a time where we do intentional things. We preach sermons and we do things to stir our hearts, to prepare, in a sense, for Jesus' coming on Christmas. And so there's a sense in which we're as a good spiritual discipline, kind of putting ourselves through the motions and getting ourselves there so that it stirs up worship for God. But it's like, if we're in the church, it's like nobody's confused about whether Jesus has already been born, right? We're going through an intentional spiritual process to kind of bring ourselves in line with it. That's the first Advent. But we have real hope, and we still are really waiting for that second Advent. And that's when Jesus promises he's going to come back again. And when he comes back, the curse against the creation, all of that, is going to be completely done away with forever. There's going to be no more Satan and no more sin. He's coming to make all things right. There's going to be no more miscarriages or divorces, no more unfruitful labor or chronic pain, no more alienation from one another or from God. He's going to make all things right. He's going to wipe every tear away that's been shed in the process. And he promises that he is going to come and he's going to make all things new. And so to that we say, come, Lord Jesus, come. On that day, we will dwell with God and all things will be right. And that's the hope of Christmas. The first Advent of the promised one is a guarantee that the second one's coming as well. Jesus has come. And we wait with persevering and joyful hope for him to come again. And so how do we apply this text? We've talked about a lot of different things. The first call is to look to Jesus in faith. Each and every one of us, if you've never put your faith in Jesus or you really don't know, I hope you feel tonight the reality of your sin before God. I hope you feel the reality that God is righteous and you're not. But I hope you recognize that righteous God stands with arms of mercy. And he offers you to come and to believe in his Son and be forgiven and be reconciled back to him. I hope that you would look to the cross and recognize that as Jesus hung on the cross, he died for sinners like you and like me. And that he promises that if you come, you will find acceptance. And that happens through faith. It happens through recognizing you're a sinner. Say, I'm going to look to Jesus. I'm going to trust him to save me. I'm going to turn and follow him now. And so I would invite you to do that. Once you've done that, here are some real practical calls to us as we finish up, because we still live in the world that's marred by sin. So how do we do that? It's pretty simple. Not easy, but simple, I would suggest. Simple in the sense that we look to Christ in hope. And then we persevere in the midst of all of it with one another. We look to Christ in hope, and we persevere in the midst of all the pains that surround pregnancy or childbirth or any of those kind of things. We look to Christ in hope, and we trust his grace in the midst of the pain of past divorce or current marital struggles. We look to Christ in hope. Men, look to Christ in hope, and then lead your families by the grace of God, trusting him for strength and help. We look to Christ in hope, and we persevere with one another amidst chronic pain and even the constant shadow of death. We look to Christ in hope, and then we even confess our sin to God. We